The cold came early to Red Hollow that October. It crept down from the mountains sometime in the second week of the month, killing the last of the wildflowers along the creek bed and turning the mud on Main Street into something hard and unforgiving. By the third Sunday, most folks had already pulled their winter coats from the cedar chests, and the old men who gathered outside Hatch's general store every morning had stopped complaining about the heat and started complaining about their joints instead. Nobody paid much attention to the cold, though. Not that week. That week, the only thing anyone in Red Hollow wanted to talk about was the Mercer girl. Check. Selene had known it was coming for longer than she let herself admit. She'd watched the signs pile up the way snow piles up on a fence post, quietly, patiently, each one small enough to ignore on its own, until one morning you wake up and the fence is gone entirely. Her father's boots had stopped getting resoled. The good lamp in the parlor had been sold, replaced by a candle stub that guttered in the draft. Her younger brother Thomas had started eating half portions at supper and calling it not hungry, even though she'd seen how he looked at the breadbasket before he pushed it away. Franklin Mercer was a proud man. Too proud. That had always been the problem. He'd borrowed against the farm twice in 5 years. Once after the river flooded their east fields and killed 2 seasons of crops in a single afternoon, and once to pay for her mother's illness, the one that had dragged on for 14 months before finally taking her in the spring. The debts had compounded the way debts do when the man holding them has more pride than practical sense. By the time Selene was 18, she understood that the farm was a ghost. It still stood. It still looked like something from the outside, but the bones of it were hollow. She never blamed her father. Not exactly. He was a man who'd been handed circumstances he didn't deserve and had made the best choices available to him, which were mostly bad ones. That was just the shape of his life. But she hadn't expected this. She found out the way she found out most things in that household. By accident, by standing in the wrong hallway at the wrong moment, her hand raised to knock on the study door, and hearing voices inside that made her stop cold. Her father's voice, low and tight, the way it got when he was ashamed of something. And another voice she didn't immediately recognize, measured, deliberate, the kind of voice that was used to being listened to. The acreage would clear the note entirely, the stranger said. I'm not interested in charity, Mr. Mercer. I'm interested in a straightforward arrangement. Her father cleared his throat. She's 19. She's young. I'm aware of her age. She doesn't know anything about ranching, about that kind of life. I'm not asking her to know anything, the voice said. I'm asking her to be willing. There was a long silence. Selene stood in the hallway with her hand still raised and her heart doing something strange and irregular in her chest. The candle stub on the side table threw her shadow long against the wall. She'll be willing, her father said finally. And something in his voice broke a little on the last word, like a green branch under too much weight. Selene put her hand down and walked back to her room without making a sound. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after that. Outside, the wind came down from the mountains and scraped along the eaves of the house. She could hear Thomas moving around in the room next to hers, the familiar creak of his floorboard, the soft knock of something being set on his dresser. She thought about a lot of things in those hours. She thought about her mother and how her mother had always said that a woman's life was a series of rooms and the trick was choosing which doors to walk through. She thought about Thomas, who was 12 and still believed that things tended to work out if you waited long enough. She thought about the East Fields and the flood, and how there had been one morning the following spring when she'd gone down to survey the damage and found a single sunflower growing up through the ruined mud like it hadn't gotten the news. She thought about all of it, and then she stopped thinking and just sat with the cold fact of it. She was going to marry a stranger. The stranger's name was Ronan Vale. Selene spent the 3 days between overhearing that conversation and meeting him for the first time collecting information, the way you collect pieces of a puzzle when you're not sure you want to see the picture. She asked careful questions. She listened in doorways. She paid attention to the pauses in people's sentences, which were often more informative than the words themselves. What she assembled was not encouraging. Ronan Vale was 34 years old. He owned a cattle ranch in the foothills north of town, 700 acres, most people estimated, though some said more. He'd come to Red Hollow about 6 years ago from somewhere further east, no one was entirely sure where, and he'd bought the old Hargrove property when it went to foreclosure. He'd spent 2 years doing nothing but working that land, mostly alone, before anyone in town even learned his last name. I was not married, had never been married, as far as anyone knew. He had no family in the area. He was known for three things. His cattle were healthy, his word was good, and he almost never spoke unless he had something specific to say. The women at the church auxiliary had other things to say about him. Selene caught pieces of their conversation through the open window of the sewing room one afternoon. Mrs. Albright's voice, high and certain, saying something about how a man that quiet was hiding something, and Martha Gaines agreeing in that particular way she had, where agreement sounded like its own kind of performance. A man his age with no wife and no intention of getting one, Mrs. Albright had started. Until now, Martha said. Well, that's just it, isn't it? He's not getting a wife, he's buying one. A pause. Then laughter, low and private and not entirely unkind, just entirely careless. The way people are careless with things that don't belong to them. Selene moved away from the window. She met Ronan Vale for the first time 4 days before the wedding, in the parlor of her family's house on a Tuesday afternoon, when the light was coming in gray through the windows and her father had made a pot of coffee that nobody wanted. He was tall, taller than she'd pictured, and dark-haired, with the kind of hands that spoke a clear biography of physical labor. He sat in the chair across from her like a man who'd gotten used to fitting himself into spaces that were slightly too small for him and had stopped minding it. He looked at her directly, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected him to look mostly at her father. Men like this, men doing business, usually talked to the other men and regarded the women as property to be assessed, like checking the teeth on a horse or the condition of a fence post. But Ronan Vale looked at her. Not intrusively, not with any particular hunger, just directly. Like she was the person in the room he'd actually come to see. Miss Mercer, he said. His voice was the same as what she'd heard through the door, measured, deliberate, without performance. Mr. Vale, she said. Her father began a speech about the weather. Nobody listened to it. I want to be honest with you, Ronan said during a lull in her father's monologue. He wasn't looking away. About what this is and what it isn't. All right, she said. It's a practical arrangement. Your father's debt, He paused briefly, and she couldn't read what was in the pause. Reasons. You'll have your own space in the house, your own room. I'm not asking you to... He stopped again, seemed to be selecting words with some care. I'm not asking for more than you're willing to give. I want to be clear about that. She studied him for a moment. The fireplace behind him was putting out more smoke than heat. One of the flues needed clearing, had needed it for months. She noticed that he noticed this. His eyes had gone to the smoke briefly before returning to her face. And if I'm willing to give very little, she said. He considered this. Then that's what I get. She didn't believe him entirely. She wasn't foolish enough to believe anyone entirely on 4 days' acquaintance. But there was something in how he said it, flatly, without reassurance, like he was stating a fact rather than making a promise, that lodged in some small part of her mind and stayed there. She said, All right. Her father looked like a man who'd been expecting to referee a longer fight and wasn't quite sure what to do with his hands now that it was over. The wedding was on Saturday. October had sharpened by then into something with actual edges. The chapel on the west end of town, Grace Methodist, which had been called something else before the previous minister left under circumstances nobody agreed on, was filled to capacity, which surprised Selene until she realized that the town had turned out not in support, but in curiosity. The pews were full of watching faces. Some were sympathetic. Most were simply interested. It was a slow week in Red Hollow, and a spectacle was a spectacle. She wore her mother's dress. There had been some discussion of getting her something new, but there wasn't money for something new, and she'd chosen this herself, partly for practical reasons, and partly because wearing her mother's things made her feel less alone. The dress was cream-colored, high-collared, and slightly too long in the hem because her mother had been 2 inches taller. She'd sewn up the hem herself, 2 nights before, by candlelight, and she hadn't done a perfect job of it, but she'd done a competent one. Thomas walked her in because there was no one else. Franklin Mercer was seated already. He'd said something about his leg, about the walk up the aisle, but she understood that what he meant was that he couldn't look at her in the dress and know what he'd done and keep walking. She didn't blame him for that either. She held Thomas's arm, and Thomas, 12 years old and doing his level best, walked her the entire length of that chapel with his chin up and his jaw set, and she was prouder of him in those moments than she'd been of almost anything in her life. Ronan was waiting at the front. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him well and looked like it had been recently purchased, which somehow made her feel something she hadn't anticipated. Not warmth, exactly, but something adjacent to it. He'd made an effort. In the circumstances, that meant something. The minister, a small, nervous man named Hewitt, who seemed vaguely distressed by the attendance, began the service with more haste than ceremony. Selene stood beside Ronan and listened to the words and did not allow herself to look at the pews, at the watching faces, at Mrs. Albright and Martha Gaines and the rest of them, cataloging everything for later consumption. When Hewitt reached the vows, Ronan turned to face her. She made herself look at him. It seemed important, in that moment, not to look away. He said the words. "I take thee, Selene, to be my wedded wife." The traditional phrasing, old as the hills, words that had been said 1,000 times in rooms like this by men and women whose inner lives were entirely their own. But he said them slowly, not hesitantly, but deliberately, like each word was being considered before it was placed, like he was choosing them, not just reciting them. "To have and to hold," he said, "from this day forward." She thought about what Mrs. Albright had said. "He's not getting a wife. He's buying one." She thought about her mother's dress and the hem she'd sewn by candlelight. She thought about Thomas, walking her with his chin up. When it was her turn, she said her vows clearly and without trembling, because she had decided somewhere between Tuesday's parlor meeting and this moment that whatever she was walking into, she would not walk into it small. She had not chosen this, but she would not be diminished by it. "I take thee, Ronan, to be my wedded husband." The chapel was very quiet. "To have and to hold from this day forward." Hewitt pronounced them married with the air of a man who'd fulfilled a contractual obligation. Ronan did not lean in to kiss her. He offered her his arm instead, and she took it, and they walked out of the chapel together into the cold October morning, while the pews rustled behind them with the sound of 200 people who had a great deal to say. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes by wagon. They rode mostly in silence, which Selene found she didn't mind. She'd half expected him to fill the space with something, reassurances, conversation, the kind of talk people use to smooth over the edges of uncomfortable situations. He didn't. He drove and she sat, and the mountains came closer as the town fell away behind them, and the silence between them was not hostile exactly. It was more like the silence between two people who haven't yet figured out how to talk to each other, but have agreed, at least, not to pretend. The ranch revealed itself slowly as they came up through the foothills. First the fences, which were newer and better maintained than she'd expected, then a barn in good repair, then the house itself, which was bigger than she'd pictured. Not grand, not comfortable in any obvious way, but solid. The kind of solid that comes from work and attention rather than money or pretension. Stone foundation, log walls chinked carefully against the cold, a porch along the front that needed a board replaced on the left side. 2 chimneys, both of which appeared to be drawing properly, which she noted with the part of her brain that was still cataloging practical details to avoid thinking about everything else. "It's not much to look at," Ronan said, the first words he'd spoken in 40 minutes. "But the roof doesn't leak." "That's more than I can say for ours," she said, before she'd decided to say it. Something moved briefly in his expression. She couldn't tell if it was amusement or something else. "I'll show you the house," he said. "You can tell me if you need anything changed." She looked at him sideways. "Changed?" "Your room, the arrangements, if something doesn't suit you." She was quiet for a moment, watching the barn get closer. "You keep saying that." "What?" "That things can be changed, that I can say if something doesn't suit me." She paused. "Most people don't say that." "Most people aren't asking someone to move to an unfamiliar place against their preferences," he said. "I agreed," she said. "Agreeing when your options are limited isn't the same thing as choosing." The wagon came to a stop in front of the house. He set the brake and didn't immediately move, and she didn't either. They sat with the horse's breath steaming in the cold and the mountains above them and the whole complicated weight of the morning settling around them like the temperature. "I know what this is," Selene said carefully. "I'm not under any illusions about it." "Good," he said. "Then we can at least start somewhere honest." He climbed down and came around to her side and offered her his hand. She took it, not because she needed the help, but because it seemed like the kind of gesture that should be acknowledged. She stepped down onto the frozen ground of the ranch that was now, in some technical and unsettling sense, also her home. The house had 4 rooms on the main floor and a loft above the kitchen that she later learned was used for storage. There was a parlor, a kitchen with a wood stove, a room he referred to as the study, though it looked more like a room where practical things happened rather than anything resembling study, and a bedroom at the back of the house. He showed her a second room off the kitchen, smaller, with a window that faced north. This was going to be a storeroom, he said. It's not finished, but I had a bed brought in last week. There's a trunk for your things. I can add a dresser if you need one. She looked at the room. It was plain and cold and slightly smaller than the bedroom she'd grown up in. The window looked out on a gray sky. This is my room, she said. If you want it, he said. Otherwise, no, she said. No, this is fine. She paused. Thank you. He nodded once and left her to it. She stood in the middle of the small room for a long time after his footsteps faded. Then she set her bag down on the trunk and sat on the edge of the bed, which was narrow and functional and had a quilt on it that looked handmade. Not by him, she suspected, but by someone. The squares were different fabrics, someone's old clothes, probably, someone's history pressed into a useful thing. She ran her fingers along the squares for a moment. Then she got up, hung her coat on the peg by the door, and went to see what the kitchen needed. She was not good at being idle. That was something she'd always known about herself. In the days that followed the wedding, the strange, suspended days of early marriage, when everything is unfamiliar and nothing has yet established a rhythm, she worked. It was the only currency she had, and she spent it deliberately. She learned where things were in the kitchen and established her own system for them. She found a crack in the parlor window that was letting in cold and stuffed it with rags until Ronan could look at it properly. She located the chicken coop behind the barn and introduced herself to the 4 hens who lived there with varying degrees of hostility. Ronan left early in the mornings. She'd hear him moving through the kitchen before dawn, the particular sounds of a person who'd lived alone long enough to move through a house like water, quietly and without disturbing anything. He'd come back in the evenings, sometimes before dark, sometimes after. He washed up at the pump outside. He came in and ate whatever was on the stove without comment, which she initially read as indifference, until she noticed that he always finished everything on his plate, and occasionally, quietly, said something brief. Good, or this is good, or once, memorably, I haven't had biscuits in a while. It wasn't much, but it was something. They talked in small pieces. That was how she'd describe it later, trying to explain it to someone who'd asked. In small pieces, like a puzzle being assembled very slowly by people who aren't sure they're working on the same picture. She learned things about him through observation more than conversation. He was methodical. He didn't do anything carelessly. He kept his tools in good order and his animals in better condition than most ranchers she'd seen, and he had a way of moving around the ranch that suggested he'd thought carefully about every system and procedure, that nothing was accidental or inherited by default. He'd had a brother once. She found this out not from him but from a photograph on the shelf in the study. 2 boys, maybe 12 and 8, standing in front of a house she didn't recognize, squinting into the sun. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't information offered, and she'd learned already that Ronan Vale held certain things back the way you hold a door against a hard wind. Not dramatically, not making a scene of it, just firmly and consistently. She had her own things she held back. That seemed fair. 2 weeks after the wedding, she went into town for the first time. She needed thread and flour and a few other things, and Ronan had a wagon going in on Tuesday morning for supplies. He offered to drive her, and she said she could manage the list herself if he had other things to do, and he looked at her for a moment and said, all right, without pressing it. She was not prepared for Red Hollow. She'd lived there her whole life, or near enough. She knew most faces by name and most names by history, but she'd been gone 3 weeks, and 3 weeks was long enough, apparently, for the town to fully develop its opinion of Ronan Vale's new wife. It started at Hatch's General Store, where Mabel Hatch, who was 57 and had strong opinions about most things, looked at her across the counter with an expression that was nearly sympathy, but not quite. Settling in all right then, are you? She said, in the particular tone that meant she was asking something else entirely. Fine, thank you, Selene said. Must be quite the change. Most changes are. Mabel Hatch looked like she'd wanted more than that, but hadn't quite known how to ask for it. She measured out the flour without further comment. It was worse on the street. 2 women she recognized, Clara Pratt and her daughter-in-law, whose name Selene could never remember, stopped when they saw her and had a brief murmured exchange that was conducted just loudly enough to be a performance. Clara looked at her with something that had started as pity and curdled over 3 weeks into something with less generosity in it. That dress, she heard as she passed. Not the rest of it, but that was enough. At the post office, old Gideon Hart, who'd known her father for 30 years, looked at her over his spectacles and said, "Your father doing better these days?" In a way that confirmed he knew exactly what arrangement had cleared Franklin Mercer's debt and what his opinion of it was. "He's well, thank you," she said. Walking back to the wagon, she passed a group of men outside the barber shop. She didn't know all of them. She knew two. One of them said something in a low voice that got a laugh from the others, and though she didn't hear the specific words, she didn't need to. The shape of it was clear enough. She put her packages in the wagon and sat on the seat and gripped the reins. Ronan had left one of the horses tied for her, and breathed through her nose until the heat in her face settled into something manageable. Not livestock, she thought, not purchased, not a transaction, but she could see from the outside how it looked. She understood the arithmetic of it, and she understood that understanding didn't make it easier. She didn't tell Ronan about the town. Not that day, not in the days following. She wasn't sure what telling him would accomplish, and she wasn't ready yet to be in that particular kind of debt, the debt of someone else's defense. She'd fought her own battles before. She would fight these. But the town didn't make it easy. Red Hollow was a particular kind of place, the kind where people genuinely believed that community meant involvement, which in practice meant that nothing was private and everything was subject to collective opinion. People weren't malicious, exactly. Most of them. They just had an enormous appetite for other people's business, and Selene's business had gotten interesting. The story, as she understood it, was being told. Franklin Mercer had sold his eldest daughter to pay his debts. Ronan Vale, who had money and no social standing, had purchased a young wife to give himself some veneer of domesticity. Selene was either a victim or a willing participant, depending on who was telling it, and neither version gave her much credit for being a person with a perspective of her own. She heard versions of this in fragments. At the dry goods store, at the well when she went to draw water, and found two neighbors there who fell into a suggestive silence when they saw her. At church the first Sunday she attended, where several women greeted her with a pointed and specific warmth that was its own kind of insult. The warmth of people who've decided you need to be handled carefully because you're either damaged or pitiful. She said the right things. She smiled the appropriate amount. She gave nothing away. But it accumulated, the way cold accumulates. Not in dramatic gusts, but in the steady, bone-deep seeping that you don't fully notice until you realize you haven't been warm in weeks. On a Thursday evening in the third week, Ronan came in from the barn to find her standing at the kitchen window with the dinner she'd made getting cold on the stove behind her. She wasn't crying, she was just standing. He set his coat on the peg and washed his hands at the basin and didn't say anything immediately, which she'd come to understand was his way of giving her space rather than pressure. "There was a letter from Thomas today," she said eventually. "Good news? He's doing well in school." She paused. "My father says the Eastfield might be productive again in the spring, if the weather cooperates." "That's good," he said. "Yes." Another pause. He moved to the stove and looked at the pot. "Can I—" "Sit down," she said. "I'll serve it." She turned from the window and busied herself with plates and bowls, and he sat at the table and waited without hurrying her, and she was grateful for that in a way she hadn't expected to be grateful for anything in this house. When they were both seated, she said, without looking up from her bowl, "People in town are saying things." She could feel him looking at her. She didn't look up. "I know," he said. "You've heard it?" "I've been hearing it for years," he said. "I'm used to it." "I'm not." "No," he said. "I know you're not." She looked up then. He was looking at her steadily, without apology and without the brisk cheerfulness that people sometimes use to dismiss other people's pain. "Does it bother you," she asked, "what they say about you?" He considered this the way he considered most things, actually, rather than performing consideration. "It used to," he said. "Less now." "How did you stop letting it?" "I stopped expecting anything different," he said, which isn't the same as not caring. It's just, he looked for the word. "It's just that I stopped being surprised by it." She thought about that. "That seems like a hard way to live." "Maybe," he said, "but it's honest." They ate in silence after that. Not an uncomfortable silence, but one that had something different in it than the silences of the previous weeks. Something that had been said and received. Later, washing up. She heard him moving in the study, the particular sound of him doing accounts or reading, whatever it was he did in the evenings. She dried her hands on the dish towel and stood for a moment in the kitchen by herself. She thought about what he'd said. I stopped being surprised by it. She wasn't sure she'd ever get there. She wasn't sure she wanted to exactly. There was something in being surprised by cruelty that meant you still expected better of people, and she wasn't ready to give that up. But she understood it, the exhaustion of it. She understood more about Ronan Vale after that conversation than she had in the entire 3 weeks prior. Not everything. She was a long way from understanding everything, but something real, something that had not been performed. She put the dish towel on its hook. Outside, the wind was coming down from the mountains again, finding its way through every gap in the old walls, filling the house with the particular sound of a long winter settling in. She went to her room and wrote a letter to Thomas, and in it she said that she was learning things she hadn't expected to learn, and that the mountains in the morning were worth seeing, and that the chickens had names now. She'd named them herself, small rebellions of normalcy in a strange place, and that she loved him and she was all right. She sealed it and set it on the shelf. Then she lay in the narrow bed under the patchwork quilt and listened to the wind and waited for morning. Outside in the cold, the mountains stood in the dark the way they always had, indifferent to marriages and debts and the opinions of small towns. They'd been there before Red Hollow, and they'd be there after. They had no opinion of Selene Mercer or what she'd walked into or what it was costing her. They were just stone and dark and cold, and in the morning they would turn gold in the first light, which was, she was learning, something. Winter settled over the Vale Ranch the way it settled over everything in the foothills, without asking permission and without any particular hurry, as though it had all the time in the world and knew it. By November, the mornings were hard with frost. Selene learned to build the kitchen fire before anything else, before coffee, before the chickens, before she'd fully opened her eyes. She'd rise in the blue dark of early morning, wrap herself in the wool shawl she'd brought from home, and make her way through the cold house to the kitchen, where the wood stove sat waiting with the particular patience of iron. She'd coax the fire from the coals she'd banked the night before, something her mother had taught her, that you never let a good fire die completely if you don't have to. And by the time the house began to warm, she'd be awake enough to face the day. It was during those early mornings, in the half hour before Ronan came through on his way out, that she felt most herself. The house was quiet and entirely hers in a way it wasn't at other hours, and she could stand at the kitchen window with her coffee and watch the frost burn off the grass as the sun came over the ridge and not be anything in particular for a little while. Not a wife. Not a daughter who'd been sacrificed, as the town would have it. Not a woman navigating the strange geography of an arranged life. Just someone standing at a window in the morning. Ronan came through at first light, same as always. He'd take coffee if she'd made it, which she always had. He didn't linger. He had a ranch to run, and the animals didn't observe polite hours. But he'd stand at the counter for a few minutes and sometimes say something brief about the day ahead, about what needed doing, about the weather coming down from the peaks. Small things. The vocabulary of a shared life, even if the life itself was still finding its shape. One morning in early November, he set his cup down and looked out the window at the eastern pasture where some of the cattle were moving in the cold, and he said, without preamble, "The fence on the north side needs work. I'll be out there most of the day." "All right," she said. "If you need anything in town," he started. "I'm fine," she said. Then, because that came out shorter than she'd intended, she added, "I thought I'd do some work on the garden plot. See what's worth salvaging before the ground freezes hard." He nodded. "There's a kitchen garden on the south side. I never touched it." "I know. I found it last week." He looked at her. "What's there?" "Mostly dead things," she said. "Some dried herb stalks. Looks like there was sage once and something that might have been thyme. Hard to tell now." She paused. "Do you know what was planted there originally?" "No," he said. "It was already neglected when I bought the place." She thought about that. The previous owner's abandoned garden, whatever it had been, whatever care had gone into it once. "I'll see what the soil's like," she said. "It might be worth planting in the spring." He seemed to consider this. "Do whatever you want with it," he said. "I will," she said, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. He took his coat and went out. She watched him cross the yard toward the barn, his breath making small clouds in the cold. And then she put on her own coat and went to investigate the South Side garden with the methodical attention she gave to any problem that could be solved with observation and time. The soil, it turned out, was excellent. She wrote to Thomas twice a week and received his letters with a regularity that steadied her. He was 12, and not naturally expressive, but he had a gift she hadn't fully appreciated before for noticing small things and reporting them accurately. His letters were full of what the dog had done, what the East Field looked like after the last rain, what their father had said at breakfast, and whether it had made sense. He wrote the way he spoke, plainly, without ornament, as though he trusted her to find the meaning herself. She saved every letter in the trunk in her room. It was becoming a kind of record, she realized, a parallel story to the one she was living, told through the eyes of a 12-year-old who missed his sister more than he'd directly say, but communicated it anyway in the particular frequency with which he mentioned her name in relation to things she'd said or done in the past. Selene always said the Eastfield drainage was the problem, he wrote in one letter, and Pa finally had Hector look at it, and Hector said the same thing, so now Pa is fixing it. Thought you'd want to know. She read that 3 times and felt something complicated, which she decided to call pride and leave at that. Her father wrote less frequently. When he did, his letters were careful in the way that guilty people are careful, full of practical information, stripped of anything that might open a conversation about what he'd done. He told her about the farm, about the weather, about Thomas's schoolwork. He asked, in the last line of each letter, if she was comfortable. Not happy. Not well. Comfortable. She always wrote back that she was comfortable. It was true enough. The first real conversation she had with Ronan, the kind where something actual was exchanged, where they were not simply reporting facts at each other across a table, happened on a Wednesday evening in mid-November when the snow came down for the first time that season, and they were both stuck indoors by it. She'd been reading in the parlor. He'd come in from checking the barn and was restless in the way that men who work outside are restless when weather keeps them in. He sat in the chair across from her and attempted to read something himself, but she could feel the energy in him that wasn't settling, a low-grade fidgeting that expressed itself not in movement, but in a kind of contained stillness that was more exhausting to maintain than actual movement would have been. After 20 minutes of this, she looked up from her book. Ask, she said. He looked at her. What? Whatever it is you want to ask, you've been working up to something for the last half hour. He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to deny it. He didn't. Your father, he said. Did he? He stopped. Did he tell you much about the arrangement before it happened? Before I found out by listening at the door? She said. A beat. Is that how it happened? Yes, she said, without particular heat. She'd had enough time with it by now that it sat differently than it had. Still sharp in places, but not as raw. I heard you talking, you and my father. I stood in the hallway for about 2 minutes, and then I went to my room and sat there for a long time. I didn't know that, he said. I know you didn't. Did he talk to you after? That evening? She looked at the fire, which she'd built up good and high against the cold. He came into my room and sat on the chair by the window and told me what the situation was. The debt, the arrangement. He was... She thought about how to describe it. He was ashamed, and that made it harder, honestly. If he'd been practical about it or cold about it, I think I'd have found that easier to be angry with. But he sat there looking like a man waiting to be sentenced, and I just... She stopped. You couldn't, Ronan said. No, she said. I couldn't. The fire made its sounds. Snow pressed against the window, soft and relentless. I thought you were going to refuse, he said. Right up until you didn't. So did I, she said. And then, because it seemed fair. Why did you want this? The arrangement. You didn't know me. You could have... There are other ways to... She gestured vaguely. You have land. You have money, or enough of it. You could have found someone who wanted to marry you. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable. She'd learned the difference between his uncomfortable silences and his thinking silences. This was the second kind. I'd been out here 6 years, he said, alone. I built something I thought I wanted, the ranch, the land, all of it, and I got it. And then I was sitting in a house by myself in the middle of 700 acres, wondering what exactly I'd built it for. He looked at the window, at the snow. I'm not... He paused, seeming to find the phrasing difficult. I don't find things easy, socially. I don't know how to do whatever people do when they're trying to be appealing. I've never been able to make small talk seem like anything other than what it is, which is a way of filling silence without saying anything. Some people find that comforting, she said. I know, I'm not one of them. She studied him. So you thought a transaction would be cleaner? He looked back at her. I thought honesty would be cleaner. An arrangement where both parties knew what it was. No pretending, no. He made a short movement with his hand. No theater. Most women would find that insulting, she said. I know that too. Do you find me insulting it? He thought about that. I don't know what you find it, he said. That's the problem. She was quiet for a moment. The snow came down and the fire burned and the house groaned slightly under the wind. I don't think I find it insulting, she said finally. I find it strange. But you were honest about it, which is more than most people are about the things they want. Your father was honest. My father was ashamed, she said. That's different. He nodded slowly like he was filing something. What happened to your brother? She said. She hadn't planned to ask it, but she was in the strange open space that honest conversation sometimes created, and the photograph on the shelf was something she'd been thinking about for weeks. He looked at her steadily. He died 7 years ago. Fever. I'm sorry. I was 22, Ronan said. The words were flat, but flatness with Ronan wasn't the same as coldness. She'd learned that too. It was the sound of something that had been grieved past its acute stage into something duller and permanent. We were going to work this land together. That was the plan. And you did it anyway, she said, alone. There wasn't a reason not to, he said. The plan didn't disappear just because he did. It just changed shape. She thought about the photograph, the two boys squinting into the sun. She thought about doing a thing alone that was meant to be done together, every day for 6 years, with the shape of the absence always present. I had a friend once, she said, when I was 16. We were going to leave Red Hollow together after school, see something larger. She married the Henderson boy instead, and now she lives 2 streets from where she grew up. She paused. It's not the same thing. No, he said, but I know what it is to have a plan that doesn't hold. They sat with that for a while. The snow kept coming. Neither of them picked up their books again that evening. It was not a transformation. She wanted to be clear about that with herself, because she'd heard enough stories where women in impossible situations found their circumstances transformed by a single good conversation or a well-timed kindness, and she distrusted that architecture. Life did not work like that. People did not work like that. What happened instead was subtler and slower and less satisfying to narrate. She learned things about him. He learned things about her. They made small adjustments, the way people do when they're sharing a space and have agreed, tacitly, not to be at war. She stopped flinching when she heard him come in from outside. He stopped apologizing for making noise in the morning. She figured out how he liked his coffee and made it that way without announcing she'd noticed. He fixed the window she'd stuffed with rags without being asked, came in one afternoon with the pane replaced and new putty around the frame, said nothing about it. They were not friends. She didn't know if they were going to be. But they were something that didn't have a clean name, 2 people in an unusual arrangement who were finding, against neither of their expectations, that the other person was not exactly what the arrangement had suggested. I was not cruel. That had been her central fear, and it had not materialized. He was not domineering. He did not treat her like property or like a domestic convenience or like something he'd purchased and expected full use of. He was thorny sometimes in conversation, opaque. He had opinions he held quietly that she occasionally ran into unexpectedly, the way you run into furniture in the dark. He was not easy, but he was honest. And she had not, in all her 19 years, met many truly honest people, and she'd come to understand that honesty was rarer and more valuable than most of the things people advertised about themselves. December came and brought the cold down harder. The cattle needed more attention in the freeze, and she saw less of him during the days. But in the evenings they had fallen into a pattern. She'd have something on the stove by the time he came in, he'd clean up and set the table without being asked, and they'd eat together in the kitchen and sometimes talk and sometimes not. The talking was getting easier. Not fluent, she didn't imagine it would be fluent for a long time, but less stilted, less like 2 people following a script for a situation neither of them quite understood. One evening she burned the onions. She'd been distracted. She'd been reading Thomas's latest letter and lost track of the stove, and by the time she smelled it, the onions were black at the bottom, and the whole kitchen smelled like regret. She pulled the pan off and looked at it with the specific frustration of someone who prided herself on competence and had just committed an elementary failure. Ronan came in from outside and stopped in the doorway, reading the situation immediately. "How bad?" he said. "The onions are gone," she said. "The rest of the stew is fine if you scrape the bottom layer." He came to the stove and looked at the pan. "I can work with that." "You don't have to." "I know how to salvage a stew," he said. He found the large spoon himself and began carefully lifting from the middle of the pot, leaving the scorched bottom undisturbed. "Hand me that other bowl." She handed it to him. He transferred the upper portion of the stew, checked it, tasted it from the spoon with the pragmatic unself-consciousness of someone who'd been feeding himself for a long time without ceremony. "It's fine," he said. "I was reading Thomas's letter," she said. "I lost track." "What did he say?" She leaned against the counter and looked at the letter she'd left on the table. "He says my father laughed at supper last week. He made a note of it like it was a weather event." Ronan glanced at her. "Is that unusual?" "Lately, yes," she said. "The debt's gone," he said, not unkindly. "That changes things for a man." "I know," she said. He distributed the salvaged stew into bowls and brought them to the table. She sat down across from him and they ate, and it wasn't until they were nearly finished that she said, "Thank you for handling the debt the way you did. My father, he needed the dignity of the arrangement more than the money itself, I think." Ronan set his spoon down. "It wasn't charity," he said. "I made that clear to him." "I know you did." She looked at him. "But you could have been harder about it. Most men would have been harder about it." "Most men aren't in my position," he said, and looked back at his bowl, and she understood that they'd arrived at the edge of something he wasn't ready to examine directly, and she didn't push it. Red Hollow had not forgotten them. She understood this with renewed clarity the second time she went into town, the week before Christmas, when the holiday had given people an additional occasion for observation. The mercantile was busy with the season's shopping, and she'd been hoping that the crowd would provide some cover, that there would be too many people and too much noise for anyone to focus specifically on her. This was optimistic. She'd been in Hatch's for 10 minutes, working through her list, when she became aware of a cluster of women near the dry goods section who were not quite looking at her and not quite not looking at her, which was its own kind of statement. She recognized two of them, Agnes Woolley, who was 60 and had opinions about everything, and a younger woman named Deirdre Stroud, who was married to the deputy and had never been particularly kind even when kindness would have cost her nothing. She focused on her list. Flour, salt, the particular kind of thread she needed for the curtains she was making for the kitchen window, because the ones that were there when she arrived were thin enough to see through, and she preferred to have some privacy when she was working. 200 acres, they say, Agnes Woolley said, in the carrying voice of someone who'd decided not to be subtle about it. As though land substitutes for everything else. Selene kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her. "Well, she'd have known what she was signing up for," Deirdre said. "At 19, you're old enough to know." "She had no choice," Agnes said, and this, irritatingly, was closer to sympathy than condemnation, which was somehow worse. That poor child had no more choice than a horse sold at auction. Selene put the thread in her basket and moved to the counter. Mabel Hatch looked at her with eyes that had taken in the entire scene. Mabel was not a bad woman. Selene had decided this, but she was a woman who lived in Red Hollow, and Red Hollow was what it was. She tallied up Selene's items without comment, and then, when she was handing over the wrapped parcels, said quietly, "Don't let Agnes Woolley bother you. She means well." "I'm not bothered," Selene said. "Of course not," Mabel said, in the tone of someone who didn't entirely believe it but respected the position. On the street, she loaded the parcels into the wagon and allowed herself 2 minutes of standing very still in the cold and breathing. 2 minutes was a reasonable allowance. She'd given herself this rule somewhere in the second week, when she'd realized that giving herself no allowance at all meant the frustration simply built until it came out sideways somewhere inconvenient, and giving herself unlimited time to be upset accomplished nothing practical. 2 minutes. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat. Coming home along the road through the foothills, she found herself going over Agnes Woolley's words. No more choice than a horse sold at auction. What made this particularly infuriating was not that it was malicious. Agnes had clearly intended it as pity, but that it was so nearly true, and the nearness of it was the problem. She'd had a choice, technically. She could have refused. She could have watched her father lose the farm, watched Thomas leave school to work, watched the whole machinery of the family's small life collapse under a debt that had been compounding for years. That was a choice the way that standing in a burning room and choosing which door to run for was a choice. Technically, you were choosing, but no one standing outside would call it freedom. She'd been choosing her family's survival. And she would do it again, she realized. Not because she'd been raised to self-sacrifice, her mother had been too practical for that kind of martyrdom, but because Thomas was 12 and deserved his schooling, and her father was a man who'd already lost his wife. And some debts were older and more binding than anything written on paper. But she wished, fiercely and without apology, that the town could see it that way, that it could be understood as a decision rather than a surrender, that there was a difference between being sold and choosing to pay. She pulled up to the ranch as the last light was going off the peaks and sat in the wagon for a moment before climbing down, looking at the house. The kitchen window was lit from inside. She'd left the lamp on, and smoke was coming from both chimneys, and the barn was closed up against the coming night, and it looked from the outside like a place where someone lived who knew what they were doing. She climbed down and brought in her parcels and started on supper, and when Ronan came in an hour later, she didn't tell him about Agnes Woolley. But she did say, somewhat abruptly, in the middle of eating, "I want to fix the porch board." He looked up. "The loose one on the left side?" "Yes." "I've been meaning to." "I can do it," she said. "I know how. My father taught me basic carpentry when I was 12 because Thomas wasn't interested and someone had to know how things worked." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you because it's your house, and I don't want you to come out one morning and find I've taken a board off your porch without warning." He held her gaze for a moment. "It's your house too," he said. "Fix whatever you want to fix." She nodded and went back to her food. And there it was again, that brief quality in how he said it that was not performance and not politeness. Just a statement of fact, delivered as though it should have been obvious. Your house too. She was still learning what to do with things like that. Christmas came to the ranch quietly. There was no family to gather, no tradition to observe, and they had not discussed the holiday enough in advance to do anything particular about it. She made a better supper than usual, a roast she'd been planning for a week, using the good cast iron pan she'd found in the back of the kitchen cupboard and cleaned up. She made bread that actually rose properly, which had been hit or miss since she'd arrived, and was finally becoming consistent. She found a jar of preserved cherries in the root cellar, and made something with them that wasn't quite a pie but was close enough. Ronan came in from the barn on Christmas evening to find the kitchen smelling like the best version of itself, and he stopped in the doorway with snow on his shoulders and looked at the table she'd set, both plates, both glasses, the cloth she'd found in the chest in the parlor, and something moved in his face that she couldn't catalog precisely. "You didn't have to," he started. "I wanted to," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She served. They ate without speaking much, but the silence had warmth in it that was different from the silences of the early weeks, less empty, more chosen. When they'd finished, she brought out the preserved cherry thing and set it on the table, and he looked at it and said, "Where did you find the cherries?" "Root cellar," she said. "There are 3 more jars. Were you saving them for something specific?" "No," he said. "I bought them at the store last spring and never—" He seemed faintly embarrassed by this, though not dramatically so. "I don't cook much beyond the basics." "I know," she said. He took a portion of the cherry thing and tasted it. She watched him. "It's good," he said. "I know," she said, and this time the corner of his mouth definitely moved, and she felt the small, strange satisfaction of having caused it. They stayed at the table longer than they usually did. The lamps burned low. Outside, snow fell again on the mountains and the ranch and the frozen ground of the kitchen garden where she was already planning what would go in come spring. "Thank you," he said, at some point near the end of the evening, "for making this." He gestured at the table, the meal, the general warmth of the room. "It's been a long time since I—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't expect it to feel like this." She looked at him. "Like what?" He thought about it. "Like something worth coming home to," he said. She didn't know what to say to that. She thought about her mother's rooms and about choices and doors. She thought about Thomas eating half portions at supper and calling it not hungry. She thought about the patchwork quilt on her narrow bed, the stranger's history pressed into something useful. "Neither did I," she said. Outside, the snow kept coming down. Inside, the lamp burned on. and the space between where they'd started and where they were now, which was not love, not yet, and not safety exactly, but something that was beginning to resemble both, felt, on that evening, like a distance that might, with time and the ordinary work of being honest with another person, be crossed. January in the foothills was a different animal than December. December had its softness, the snow falling in the particular gentle way of early winter, the cold still carrying some novelty, the holiday giving ordinary days a temporary warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. January had no such illusions. January was the month that meant it. The cold came down from the peaks with a kind of flat determination. The sky went gray and stayed there, and the world contracted to the distance between the house and the barn and the fence line and back again. Selene had grown up in this valley and knew its winters, but she'd never spent one at altitude before, and the foothills were not the same as town. The wind had more reach out here. The mornings were harder. The distance between neighbors, between her and anyone who might stop by or wave from a passing wagon, was longer in a way that was both physical and something else, something harder to name. She kept herself occupied because occupation was the only remedy she trusted. The kitchen garden planning had become a real project by now. She'd drawn up rough diagrams on paper by lamplight, working out what would go where, what the soil needed, what the south-facing slope could support, and what it couldn't. She'd written to Thomas asking if their father still had the seed catalog from 2 years back, the one with the section on root vegetables, and Thomas had written back that he'd found it and sent along the relevant pages with careful annotations in his own hand. Pa said this variety does better in cold soil. Also, the chickens got into the east bed again. She fixed the porch board the first week of January, on a morning when the cold was sharp, but the wind had paused. Ronan came out to find her crouched over the replacement plank with a hammer and nails, her breath making clouds, her hands red from the cold. He stood watching for a moment before she was aware of him. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell across the board she was working. "You're doing it wrong," he said. She looked up at him. "I'm doing it fine. The angle's off. You'll split it." She looked at the nail. She looked at the board. She looked back at him. "Show me then." He came down and crouched beside her, closer than they usually were, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold air, and took the hammer from her hand with the directness of someone who was not trying to take anything, just trying to fix the board. He adjusted the angle slightly and drove the nail in clean, the way she had not quite managed it. "The grain," he said. "You go against it, you'll get a crack eventually." "I didn't know that," she said. "Now you do." He handed the hammer back. She drove the next nail herself, at the correct angle, and it went in right. He didn't comment on this, just stood up and went back toward the barn. She finished the board, tested it with her foot, solid, and went inside to warm her hands. That was January. Small lessons, small exchanges. The distance between them shrinking by increments so gradual that she couldn't have said, on any given day, exactly how far they'd come from where they'd started. The gathering at Grace Methodist was announced the second Sunday of February. It was a monthly event, a social occasion that the church held in its adjoining hall, ostensibly for community news and planning, but in practice functioning as the town's primary formal gathering, the place where social standing was established and reinforced and occasionally undermined. Ronan had not attended any of these in the years he'd been in Red Hollow, which had been noted and added to the general accounting of his strangeness. He mentioned it over breakfast with the specificity of a man who had been thinking about it and had reached a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "There's a gathering at the church hall this coming Saturday," he said. "I think we should go." Selene set her coffee cup down and looked at him. "You think we should?" "It would be," he paused. "It would be good for you to have more of a presence in town, so people can, so it's not just rumors," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Agnes Woolley and Deirdre Stroud and the women in hatches who talked in carrying voices. She thought about how, since the December visit, she'd been back to town twice more, and it had not improved. If anything, the town's appetite for the subject of her marriage had only grown as the novelty continued past the point where people might have expected it to dissolve into ordinary life. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to—" "I said all right," she said. "I'm not afraid of them." This was not entirely true, but it was true enough to act on. They arrived at the church hall on Saturday afternoon in the wagon, Selene in the best dress she'd brought from home, dark blue wool, high-collared, nothing she was ashamed of, and Ronan in the dark suit from the wedding, which still fit him well, and which he wore with the slight discomfort of a man who dressed up for practical rather than pleasure reasons. The hall was already full when they arrived. Selene heard the ambient noise of it from outside. The particular sound of a community gathered in an enclosed space, everyone talking at once, layered conversations creating something that was individually intelligible and collectively overwhelming. She had a moment in the doorway, just a moment, where the noise hit her like a wall and she felt the specific anxiety of walking into a room where you know you are the subject of conversation. Then she walked in. Ronan was at her shoulder, not in front, not dramatically protective, just present in the straightforward way he was present at most things. She appreciated the calibration. The room shifted slightly when they entered. It was subtle, a ripple of altered attention, conversations pausing a beat longer than natural before resuming. She saw it in peripheral vision and recognized it and kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral. The minister, Hewitt, came over first with the anxious sociability of a man perpetually trying to smooth things. Mr. Vale, Mrs. Vale. The name landed strangely, as it always did. She'd been Mrs. Vale for 4 months, and it still felt like a costume. "So glad you could join us. Thank you for having us," she said. They moved through the room. Ronan spoke when spoken to and didn't seek out conversation, which was consistent with what she'd learned of him. She made more effort. She'd been raised to understand that social competence was a skill like any other, that you developed it through practice, whether or not it came naturally, and she'd always been better at it than the anxiety she felt would suggest. She talked to several people. A farmer named Garfield Pruitt, who was gruff and practical and clearly had no particular opinion about her marriage beyond mild curiosity, talked to her about the north side soil conditions for nearly 15 minutes, and seemed to find her questions intelligent, which she appreciated. A woman named Clara Fenn, who was young and newly arrived in Red Hollow herself, talked to her about the general difficulty of winters in the foothills, with a camaraderie that felt genuine if tentative. These were ordinary interactions, people being people. She held on to them. And then there was the corner of the room where Agnes Woolley held court. Agnes was not alone. She had around her the particular cluster of women who gathered around certain kinds of social authority. Not all of them unkind, but all of them oriented toward the center, toward Agnes, in the way that people orient toward whoever in the room has decided to set the tone. Martha Gaines was there. Deirdre Stroud was there. 3 other women whose names Selene knew in the associative way of small-town life, connected to husbands, to families, to positions on streets, but not well. She didn't intend to go near them. She'd been managing the room's geography deliberately, keeping to its other half. But the hall was not large, and the gathering had a way of shifting, and at some point in the late afternoon she found herself at the refreshment table at the same moment as Agnes Woolley, close enough for conversation to be unavoidable without being rude. "Mrs. Vale," Agnes said. The name again, delivered with a particular emphasis. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Mrs. Woolley. Married life must agree with you." A pause, precisely calibrated. "In whatever form it takes." Selene looked at her directly. "It takes the ordinary form," she said evenly. Agnes's mouth curved slightly. "Of course." She reached for a cup of tea. "We were just saying—" She gestured toward the cluster of women a few feet away who were listening with the performance of not listening. "We were just saying how unusual it must be for a young woman of, well, of your circumstances." "My circumstances," Selene repeated. "Coming from a family with difficulties." Agnes managed to make sympathy sound like a verdict. "And finding yourself in an arrangement of this kind. It must require a great deal of adaptation." "Most things worth doing require adaptation," Selene said. Her voice was still level. She was working to keep it level. "Quite right," Agnes said, "though of course some adaptations are more voluntary than others." And there it was, wrapped in enough layers of politeness that denying it would look like paranoia, but present. Nakedly present. You had no choice. You were sold. You are not here by your own will. Martha Gaines made a sound that might have been a laugh and covered it poorly. "I find," Selene said, and something in her had shifted, had moved from management to something more direct and less safe. "I find it interesting that the people most concerned with the voluntariness of my situation are the same people who would have given me no good options either way." Agnes blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "If my family had lost the farm," Selene said, "and Thomas had been pulled out of school, and my father had had nothing, What would Red Hollow have had to say about that? Would you have called it strength? Dignity? She held Agnes's gaze without wavering. Or would you have had something to say about a family that couldn't manage its own affairs? The corner of the room had gone quiet. The performance of not listening had dropped entirely. I made a choice, Selene said. It was not an easy choice, and it was not made in ideal circumstances, and I am aware that it looks like something from the outside that it does not feel like from the inside. But it was mine, and I would appreciate— She paused, keeping her voice from shaking through pure will. I would appreciate it if the women of this town could find it in themselves to treat it as such. Agnes Woolley stared at her. Nobody in the immediate vicinity appeared to be breathing. My family's survival is not a scandal, Selene said, and my husband is not what you've decided he is. She set her cup down on the table with a click that was louder than she'd intended, and turned and walked away through a room that had gone half quiet in a spreading ripple from the corner, and she did not look back to see their faces. Ronan found her near the door 5 minutes later. He looked at her once, a quick read, the way she'd seen him assess a fence line or a weather front, rapid and accurate. What happened? Nothing, she said. I'm ready to go. Selene. She looked at him. His expression was not alarmed. Ronan was rarely alarmed, but it was attentive in the particular way she'd come to recognize, the way he looked when he was actually listening, rather than simply waiting for her to finish. Agnes Woolley said something, she said. I said something back. It's done. What did you say? I told her that my choice was mine and that the town could treat it that way. He was quiet for a moment. And? And the room heard it. She looked at the wall across from her. So now the room will have a different thing to talk about. Was that wise? He said. Not critically, genuinely asking. Probably not, she said, but it was true, and I was tired of— She stopped, found a word. I was tired of being narrated. He absorbed this. Then he said, all right, and got their coats. They rode home mostly in silence. The cold was sharp and clean after the enclosed warmth of the hall, and the mountains above them were going blue-purple in the late afternoon light, and she sat in the wagon with her hands in her lap and felt the adrenaline of what she'd done draining slowly into something that was partly satisfaction and partly the specific dread of consequences not yet arrived. You shouldn't have to defend yourself to them, Ronan said, somewhere in the foothills. Or me. I know, she said, but I did anyway. I know. A pause. I heard some of it. She looked at him. How much? Enough, he said, and then after a moment, thank you. She looked at the road ahead. Don't thank me. I did it for myself as much as anything. I know that too, he said. The consequences arrived inside a week. She'd known they would. That was the calculation she'd made in the corner of the hall, the split-second accounting of what it would cost to say what she'd said, and she'd decided to pay it. But knowing a price is coming and paying it are different experiences. The first consequence was that the town's conversation about her changed register. Before, there had been the kind of talk that lives in implication and sympathy and the performance of concern. After, there was something with more edge in it, the particular hostility that arises when someone has refused the role they were assigned, and the people who assigned it have decided to take offense. Agnes Woolley, she heard through Mabel Hatch, who was constitutionally unable to keep information entirely to herself, had said that Selene Vale had an attitude unsuitable for a woman in her position. Deirdre Stroud had apparently said something worse that Mabel declined to repeat, but communicated through her expression. When Selene went to town the following Tuesday for provisions, she was met with the specific coldness of people who decided to express displeasure through withdrawal rather than confrontation. Shop owners were polite in the minimal sense. They served her, took her money, made correct change. They did not chat. They did not ask after things. At the dry goods store, the woman behind the counter, Janet Polk, who had previously been pleasant in the idle way of people who are pleasant by default, gave her her goods without making eye contact. Selene brought everything home and put it away in the kitchen and stood at the window for a few minutes in the gray February light. She was not going to cry about Janet Polk not making eye contact. She was absolutely not going to do that. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table with Thomas's most recent letter and read it twice. He'd drawn a small picture at the bottom, a rough sketch of the dog, labeled Old Earl in his inexact handwriting, and it made her smile before she'd decided to smile, which was its own kind of gift. The second consequence was harder. It came in the form of a conversation she overheard at the well 10 days after the gathering. She'd gone to draw water in the early afternoon. Ronan was out on the north fence, and two men she recognized as belonging to the social world of Red Hollow, not farmers, but the kind of men who did business and knew everyone, were there ahead of her and had not heard her approach on the frozen ground. Bill's been out here 6 years and never caused trouble, one of them was saying, and now his wife is out here making speeches in the church hall. She's young, the other said. Young and proud. You expect him to control his own household better. Well, that's just it. A man who pays off debt for a girl's hand. There's questions about the whole arrangement already, and now, Hargrove said his wife heard the whole thing, said the Mercer girl practically accused Agnes Woolley of hypocrisy in front of half the town. Agnes Woolley is a hypocrite, the first man said, which would have been almost amusing in different circumstances. But that doesn't mean you say it out loud. She drew her water and made enough noise doing it that they became aware of her. The conversation stopped. One of the men, she thought his name was Delman, she wasn't sure, looked at her with the expression of someone who's been caught and is debating whether to be embarrassed or defiant, and settled for a middle path of acknowledging her presence without making eye contact. She carried her water back to the house. She set the bucket down in the kitchen and stood with her hands gripping the edge of the counter and worked through the arithmetic of what she'd heard. A man who pays off debt for a girl's hand. As though Ronan's character, his 6 years of honest labor, his maintained fences and healthy cattle and good word, as though all of that could be reduced to and overwritten by the transaction, as though the transaction was the only truth worth keeping, and expect him to control his own household better. She stood with that for a long time. The thing that made it worst was the understanding that this was not going away. She'd thought, had let herself think, that if she said something direct, if she refused the narrative clearly enough, it might shift. But narratives don't shift because you're right. Narratives shift for their own reasons, on their own time, and in the meanwhile the people inside them simply had to continue being inside them. She was a woman who had been purchased, as far as Red Hollow was concerned, and her fighting it was not evidence against the theory, but simply another data point to be incorporated. The purchased girl who thought she had opinions, the bought bride who'd forgotten her place. She was causing Ronan damage. That was the clear and cold conclusion she arrived at, standing at the counter. His reputation, which was apparently the primary thing he had in this town, had been built on 6 years of reliable behavior and consistent character, and her fighting with Agnes Woolley was being mapped onto him, and the map said, a man who can't manage his wife. She hadn't thought of it that way. She'd been thinking only of herself, of her own refusal to be diminished. She hadn't calculated what it cost him. That evening at supper, she was quieter than usual, and he noticed, he always noticed, she'd come to understand, far more than his silence suggested, and he said, "Something's wrong." "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at him across the table. "I may have made things harder for you, in town, by what I said at the gathering." I was quiet for a moment. "Who told you that?" "No one told me. I'm not stupid." "No," he said. "You're not." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, which was the closest he came to fidgeting. "And yes, probably. It's complicated things." "I'm sorry," she said. The words came out stiffly. She was not, she'd discovered, naturally apologetic, and saying it when she actually meant it was harder than she'd expected. "I wasn't thinking about what it would. I was thinking about my own. Don't apologize for saying what was true," he said. "Ronan, you said my name," he said. She stopped. It was the first time she'd used his given name directly in conversation. She'd been avoiding it without quite knowing why, some instinct about distance that she'd been maintaining without examining. "I mean it. Don't apologize. Agnes Woolley's been running her mouth about me for 4 years. Whatever you said to her, she earned." "I said your name," she said. "I noticed," he said. And something in his expression, something behind the flatness, shifted. She looked at her food. "The town thinks you can't manage your household." "The town can think what it wants." "That doesn't bother you?" "It does," he said. "But not because of what they think, because—" He stopped, started again more carefully. "Because I don't want this to cost you more than it already has." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I brought you into a situation," he said, with open eyes about what it was. "But the way it's playing out, the way the town has decided to—" He shook his head slightly. "I didn't account for what they'd do with it." "You couldn't have," she said. No, but I still... He looked directly at her, which he always did when he was saying something he'd decided to say. I don't want you to be paying for my choices indefinitely. She held his gaze. Your choices and my choices both, she said. I agreed to this. Agreeing when your options are limited isn't the same thing as choosing, she finished. You said that before, the first day. Yes, he said. I've been thinking about that, she said. About whether it's true. She looked at the window, where the dark had fully come down. I think it depends on the person making the choice. I think I made the choice that made sense to me with what I had. And I've been making choices here too, smaller ones, every day. Whether to talk to you or not. Whether to fix the porch board or leave it. Whether to plant the garden. She paused. Those are choices. Yes, he said. They are. So I'm not... She found the word. I'm not only what happened in October. I'm also what's been happening since. He looked at her for a long moment. I know that, he said. The town doesn't, she said. But you do. And I think right now that matters more. She wasn't sure where that had come from exactly. But it was true. And she knew it was true when she said it, and she could see that he knew it too. March came in hard and cold and then, unexpectedly, broke early. The third week of March brought 3 days of warmth that felt like a mistake, like the season had miscounted and needed to correct itself. But it was warmth, genuine warmth, and the ground under the south side garden began to soften. She spent an afternoon out there, turning soil with the fork she'd found in the barn, getting a feel for the texture and composition of it. The work was good, physical and immediate and entirely clear in its feedback. The soil was dark in places and compacted in others, and there was evidence, if you looked carefully, of what had been here before, an old root system that had belonged to something substantial, probably years ago. Someone had cared about this plot. Someone had worked it, and then, eventually, stopped. She was crouched down, examining a section of soil near the south fence, when she heard boots behind her and looked up to find Ronan standing at the edge of the garden plot, watching her work. I thought you were fixing the east fence, she said. Done, he said. It didn't take as long as I thought. He came to the edge of the plot and looked at the turned soil. You'll want to amend it, he said. The composted material from the barn would help. I was going to ask about that, she said. I'll bring some over tomorrow. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden with an expression she hadn't quite seen before, not the focused practical attention he gave to ranch problems, but something slower, something that was thinking about something other than the immediate task. My brother's wife planted a garden, he said. It was unprompted, which was unusual. Where we grew up, tomatoes mostly. She was very particular about the tomatoes. Selene kept still. She'd learned that with Ronan, when something real was being offered, you didn't move toward it too quickly. We didn't have a garden here, he said. I thought about it once or twice. Didn't seem worth the trouble for one person. And now? She said. He looked at her. Now there are two, he said simply. She turned back to the soil. Her hands were dirty, and her knees were cold from the ground, and the afternoon light was going gold over the ridge. And she thought, carefully, and without letting herself make too much of it, that this was what it looked like when a thing changed. Not a dramatic shift. Not a moment anyone would point to and say there, that was when it happened. Just two people in a garden at the end of a March afternoon, and two people was more than one, and that was the difference. I'm going to plant tomatoes too, she said, if the season cooperates. It usually does, he said. By July. She nodded and kept working, and he crouched down beside her and started on a compacted section near the fence, and they worked in silence until the light was too low to see clearly. Neither of them said much else. They didn't need to. What they didn't know, crouched over the warming earth in the quiet March afternoon, was that Red Hollow was not finished with them. That the town's appetite, which Selene had taken on directly and Ronan had spent years simply enduring, was building towards something that would require more of them than either of them had yet had to give. That the fragile and unbeautiful and genuinely real thing growing between them was about to be tested in a way that gardens and porch boards and honest conversations over a kitchen table could not prepare them for. The warm spell broke the following day. Snow came back, light but persistent, covering the turned soil of the garden and the fixed board on the porch and the east fence Ronan had repaired, and the ranch sat under it quiet and gray as it always had, as though nothing was different. But something was different, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it, and that was precisely the way that the real things tended to begin. The snow that had covered the garden at the end of March melted by the first week of April, and the soil she'd turned came back up dark and ready, and for a while the ranch existed in a kind of suspended calm that she would later recognize as the particular quiet that precedes the thing you weren't prepared for. April was genuinely beautiful in the foothills. She hadn't expected that. She'd been braced for more gray, more cold, more of the landscape's flat refusal to offer anything easy. But April came in with color. The grass on the lower slopes went green almost overnight, the way it does at altitude when the season finally commits. And there were wildflowers along the creek bed that she'd walk down to look at in the mornings, when the light was still low and the air still cold enough to see her breath. Small things, yellow and white and a particular blue that she didn't know the name of. She made a note to ask someone who would know. The kitchen garden was her primary occupation in those weeks. Ronan had brought the composted material from the barn as promised, and she'd worked it into the soil in sections, and the whole project had taken on a momentum and specificity that she found genuinely absorbing. She'd ordered seeds through the mail, a transaction that had required navigating the post office in Red Hollow, where Gideon Hart had been precisely cordial in the way of someone who had decided to be precisely cordial and nothing else. And they'd arrived in a brown envelope that she'd opened at the kitchen table with the particular pleasure of things anticipated becoming things actual. Ronan had watched her sort the seed packets one evening, labeling small sections of the garden plot diagram she'd been refining. He'd said, "You're good at planning," in the way he said most things, as observation rather than compliment, which she'd learned to receive as the same thing. "I like knowing what comes next," she said, "even if it doesn't go according to plan." "Does it usually?" "No," she said, "but having the plan helps anyway." He'd nodded at that in the way he nodded at things that confirmed something he'd already thought. They were in a different place than they'd been in October, or December, or even March. She could feel it without being able to precisely articulate it, the way you can feel a change in a room's temperature before you can name the exact degree. Something had opened between them, not dramatically, not in any single conversation, but through the accumulation of honest exchanges and shared labor and the ordinary daily business of two people who had decided, without ceremony, to stop holding quite so much back. He'd told her more about his brother. Not in one conversation. It came in pieces, the way most things came with Ronan, like he was rationing information not from secretiveness, but from some deep-seated uncertainty about how much space his own grief was allowed to take up. His brother's name had been Daniel. He'd been funny, apparently. The kind of funny that finds the absurdity in ordinary things, which Ronan described with something in his voice that was not exactly wistfulness, but was in the same family. They'd worked the land in the east where they'd grown up, and the plan had been to come west together, to buy something larger than inheritance would provide, and they'd been 2 years away from having enough saved when the fever came. "He died in 4 days," Ronan had said one evening, not looking at her, looking at the fire. "He was sick in the morning and gone by Thursday. I was there for all of it, and I still don't—" He'd stopped. "I still don't understand the speed of it." "No," she'd said. "I don't think you're supposed to." He'd looked at her then. "My mother didn't recover. She's still alive, but she didn't recover." "Is that why you don't go back?" "Partly," he said, "and partly because going back would be—" he found the word. "Confirming that it's permanent, that this is what happened, and it didn't unhappen." She'd thought about her mother, and how for months after the funeral she'd set 2 cups on the table before catching herself. "I know what you mean," she said. "I know you do," he said. That kind of exchange. That was where they'd arrived by April. A place where certain real things could be said and received without either of them performing a reaction. She was not in love with him. She wasn't sure what she was. But she'd stopped being careful around him in the way you're careful around a stranger. And that was something. Wow. The thing that unraveled it started with a letter. It came on a Wednesday in the second week of April, addressed to Ronan but delivered when he was out on the range. She brought it inside and left it on the table and thought nothing more of it until that evening when he came in and opened it and read it standing at the kitchen counter without sitting down. She was at the stove and didn't look directly at him, but she was aware of the particular quality of his stillness as he read. Different from his ordinary stillness, which was settled and self-contained. This was the stillness of something being absorbed. "Bad news?" she said, without turning around. A pause. "Land dispute," he said. "There's a family, the Caldwells, who've been claiming that the eastern boundary of my property was misregistered when I bought the Hargrove place. They've hired an attorney." She turned around then. "Can they do that?" "Anyone can hire an attorney," he said. The edge in it was not directed at her, but it was present. "Whether they have a case is different. My deed is clear, but—" He set the letter down. "But it'll require going into town, seeing a lawyer, probably more than once." "Who are the Caldwells?" "Family about 8 miles east. I've had—" He paused. "There's been friction over the fence line. 2 years ago, I had to move a section of fence because their cattle were getting through, and the conversation about it wasn't friendly," she said. "No." She thought about this. "Is this connected to—" She stopped, uncertain how to say it. "To the town?" he said. "To the way the town feels about me right now?" He looked at the letter. "I don't know. Possibly. The Caldwells have cousins in Red Hollow. Agnes Woolley is one of them." The name settled in the kitchen like something dropped. "Agnes Woolley," she said. "I didn't say she had anything to do with it," he said. "I said the Caldwells have cousins in town." "But you thought it," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I thought it." She turned back to the stove because she needed to be doing something with her hands. The pot in front of her needed stirring, and she stirred it and thought about Agnes Woolley and the gathering and what she'd said in front of half the town, and she thought about the men at the well saying expect him to control his own household better, and she felt something that was close to nausea but was actually guilt. The specific guilt of having contributed to a problem she hadn't invented but had possibly enlarged. "Ronan," she said. "Don't," he said. "I haven't said anything yet." "You're about to say it's your fault," he said. "It isn't." "I aggravated things," she said, "at the gathering. I know that." "The Caldwells' land dispute has nothing to do with what you said to Agnes Woolley," he said, firmly enough that she almost believed it. "They've been looking for an angle on that eastern boundary for 2 years. They would have found one eventually." She served supper without further discussion. But the letter sat on the table all through the meal like a third party. Neither of them acknowledged, and when they were finished, she watched him pick it up and read it again before folding it carefully and putting it in his coat pocket. And she understood that it had changed something in the atmosphere of the evening, had introduced a new weight into a month that had, until today, been quietly going well. The lawyer's name was Aldrich Pruitt, and he had an office above the hardware store on Main Street, and he was competent in the careful, limited way of small-town legal practice. Ronan went to see him the following Monday and came home that evening with the summary of what it would take, which was documentation, patience, a surveyor, and money that Ronan had but would rather have spent on other things. "He thinks we have a solid case," Ronan told her. "The deed is clear. The survey that Hargrove commissioned when he originally bought the land shows the boundary exactly where I've maintained it. The Caldwells are arguing that the original survey was inaccurate, which Pruitt says is going to be difficult for them to prove. But it'll take time," she said. "Months, probably." She nodded. "And money." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "It doesn't affect the ranch's operations. I want you to know that. It doesn't put us in a difficult position." She noted the U.S. and filed it somewhere. "I wasn't worried about that," she said. "I know. I just wanted to say it." The land dispute moved slowly through April and into May, a background presence that Ronan dealt with through trips to Pruitt's office and the methodical assembly of documentation, and that Selene lived with as a low-grade awareness of something unresolved pressing against the otherwise ordinary texture of their days. She noticed that he slept less easily during those weeks. She could tell by the sounds of the house, the particular creak of him moving through the kitchen earlier than usual in the mornings, the lamp in the study burning later than it had before. She didn't say anything about it. She started making coffee in larger quantities and leaving it on the back of the stove where it would stay warm, and she made sure there was something in the kitchen he could eat without effort in the early mornings. And she said nothing about any of this because it would have embarrassed him to have it named. But one evening she came into the kitchen to find him sitting at the table with the documentation spread out in front of him. Deeds, survey maps, letters. And he had the look of a man who'd been at it a long time without finding the thing he needed. And she sat down across from him and said, "Tell me what you're looking for." He looked up. "You don't need to—" "Tell me," she said. "I'm good at finding things. It's one of my better qualities." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned a survey map around toward her and began explaining. She listened carefully, asked 3 questions, and within 20 minutes had found the specific notation in the original Hargrove survey that corroborated Ronan's position on the eastern boundary more clearly than anything he'd located thus far. He stared at it. "How did you—" "It's just reading," she said. "You were too close to it." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "You can take it to Prewitt tomorrow," she said, and got up to make more coffee, and that was that. May arrived and the garden came up. Not all of it. Never all of it. In gardening, there was always a percentage that simply declined and had to be accepted, but most of it. The tomatoes came up, and so did the beans and the sage she'd planted from seed, and there was something else growing in the corner of the plot that she hadn't planted, something volunteered from the soil's own memory, and she left it to see what it would be. It turned out to be a kind of tough mountain herb she didn't have a name for, strong-smelling and persistent and entirely unsentimental about where it had been put, which she found she respected. Ronan came to look at the garden one morning in early May and stood at the edge of it for a long time without saying much. "The tomatoes will need staking," he said finally. "I know. I'm going to do it this week." The soil held better than I expected. "I told you it was good soil," she said. "You did," he said. She was aware that he was not really talking about soil. She wasn't entirely sure what he was talking about, or whether he knew himself. But she let it be what it was. A man standing at the edge of a garden that had not existed 4 months ago, in the company of a woman who had not been here 4 months ago, looking at something that had grown. "My brother would have liked this," he said. He liked things that grew, not the ranch work so much. He liked the other kind of growing. "Tell me something about him," she said. "Something specific." He thought about it. "He used to sing while he worked," he said. "Badly. He knew he was bad and he did it anyway. Said there was no point in only doing things you were good at." She smiled. "He sounds like Thomas." "How so?" "Thomas has no ability whatsoever to draw," she said. "He draws things constantly. Dogs, mostly. They look like potatoes with legs. He labels them so you know what they are." Something happened in Ronan's face that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest he came to one. A brief, involuntary shift that he didn't entirely succeed in suppressing. "He sent one with a letter," he said. "I saw it on the table." "Old Earl," she said. "The dog." "I thought it was a cloud with feet," he said. She did laugh, then actually laughed, which surprised her slightly, the ease of it. And after a moment he made the sound that was his version of it, low and brief and genuine, and it was the first time she'd heard him laugh. And it was not elegant or particularly musical, but it was real, and she thought that was considerably better. It was the middle of May when she started having trouble sleeping. She didn't examine it closely at first. She put it down to the change in seasons, to the longer light, to the general restlessness of a month that was warmer and more awake than the ones before it. She'd wake in the early hours, 2, 3 in the morning, and lie in the narrow bed in her room, listening to the house settle and the wind move through the trees along the creek, and something in her chest that was doing something she didn't have clean words for. She understood slowly and with the specific reluctance of a practical person confronting an impractical situation, in the process of feeling something about Ronan Vale that went considerably past the careful, measured regard she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. This was inconvenient. She went through the inventory of it with the honesty she tried to bring to most things. She respected him. She trusted him, which had taken longer and was worth more. She looked forward to evenings in a way she hadn't in the beginning, the supper and the conversation, and the particular quality of his attention when she was talking, the way he listened like he was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn. She'd been watching his hands for weeks without quite admitting that she was watching them, the way they moved when he was explaining something, careful and economical. She'd been thinking about the laugh, the one by the garden, replaying it with the involuntary persistence of a detail that had meant something. She was not going to call it love. Not yet. Possibly not ever. She'd seen enough of what people called love to know. It was a word that got applied to a wide range of things, some of which were genuine and some of which were need or convenience or fear operating under more appealing names. She did not know precisely what this was. She knew it was real, and that it was growing, and that the growing of it was in direct proportion to the degree to which she had not planned for it. She also knew, lying in the dark in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the house, that it complicated everything in a way she wasn't ready to navigate. Because the arrangement had a shape, it had a structure, and feelings that existed outside that structure, that changed its terms without any conversation having been had, were a different kind of problem than the practical problems she'd been solving since October. She did not tell him. She wasn't ready to tell him. She wasn't sure telling was the right word for what would need to happen. It wasn't information to be transmitted, it was a question to be asked, and she wasn't ready to ask it because she didn't know if she could handle the answer. If he didn't feel the same, if what she'd been reading in his silences and his proximity and his laugh by the garden was not what she thought it was, but simply the ordinary warmth of two people living in close quarters who'd decided to be decent to each other, then naming it would change the careful, honest, imperfect thing they'd built. And she was not willing to risk that lightly. So she kept it to herself and slept badly and planted her tomatoes and found documentation for land surveys and made coffee in the early mornings, and waited to understand what came next. What came next was not what she'd been waiting for. It was a Saturday afternoon in the third week of May. Ronan had gone into Red Hollow for a meeting with Prewitt about the land dispute. The surveyor's report had come back and it said exactly what Prewitt had predicted, corroborating the original deed, and the Caldwell's attorney was apparently in the process of reassessing their position. It was not over, but it was turning. Ronan had seemed, that morning before he left, slightly less weighted than he'd been in recent weeks. She'd noticed and been glad. She'd spent the morning in the garden and the early afternoon mending a section of fence along the south side that had been leaning badly since winter. She was not an experienced fence repairer, but she was a competent reader of problems. And the problem here was clear enough. Two posts had heaved in the freeze and needed to be reset and properly packed. She was in the middle of this, muddy to the elbows, when she heard the wagon on the road. Too early for Ronan. She shielded her eyes and looked toward the road and saw a wagon she didn't recognize, and in it, two women. They pulled up to the gate and stopped, and she recognized, with a sinking clarity, Clara Pratt, the woman who'd been with her daughter-in-law the day Selene had walked past and heard that dress. And another woman she didn't know, younger, with the look of someone accompanying an older relative as social reinforcement. She set the fence post driver down and brushed her hands on her work trousers, not the dress she'd have chosen for company, not by a significant margin, and walked to the gate. "Mrs. Pratt?" she said. "Mrs. Vale." Clara Pratt looked at her work clothes with an expression she made no great effort to control. "We were passing and thought we'd stop. I hope that's all right." People who drove out 6 miles from town to stop and pass an hour did not stop by accident, but Selene said, "Of course, come in." She brought them inside and made tea with the automatic hospitality of someone raised to it, and they sat in the parlor, which she'd been gradually improving since her arrival. Simple things. A better lamp, curtains she'd made herself, the rug she'd moved from the corner where it had been inexplicably placed to a position that made actual sense. And Clara Pratt looked around with the appraising gaze of someone making notes. "You've made it homely," she said, and it was almost a compliment, but not quite. "I've been working on it," Selene said. The younger woman, Clara's niece, it emerged, named Harriet, visiting from the next county, was quieter than her aunt and seemed less certain of the errand's purpose. She drank her tea with the slightly uncomfortable look of someone who hadn't known exactly what they were volunteering for. "We wanted to see how you were getting on," Clara said. "It's been a while since the gathering." "I've been getting on fine," Selene said. "And Mr. Vale? We understand there's been some difficulty with the Caldwells." Small towns. "The matter is being handled," she said. Clara set her teacup down with a small sound. "Selene," the given name, which they had not previously been on terms to use, "I want to say something, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended." "I'll try," Selene said. "What you said to Agnes Woolley at the gathering." "I said what was true," Selene said. "Yes, I know." Clara paused. "Agnes is a difficult woman. She always has been. What I want to say is that not everyone in Red Hollow feels the way Agnes does. Some of us—" She stopped, seemed to be selecting something carefully. "Some of us think you've been handled unfairly." Selene looked at her. "That's kind of you to say." "I should have said it sooner," Clara said, with a directness that surprised Selene slightly. I've watched what's happened, and I haven't said anything, and that has its own cost." There was a brief silence. Harriet looked at her teacup. "It does," Selene agreed. "Your husband—" Clara paused again, as though weighing. "Whatever the arrangement was, I've watched how he conducts himself in this town for 6 years. He's not what Agnes has made him out to be." "No," Selene said. He's not. Clara seemed to have delivered what she'd come to deliver. The conversation moved to lighter things after that. The season, the road conditions, Harriet's impressions of the valley, and they stayed another 20 minutes before making their excuses and climbing back into the wagon. At the gate, Clara paused. "I'll speak to Mabel Hatch," she said. "She listens to what I say." Selene wasn't sure what to make of this or how much it would actually accomplish, but she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pratt," and meant it, and stood at the gate watching the wagon go until it disappeared around the bend in the road. She went back to the fence and stood looking at the half-finished post repair for a moment before picking up the driver again. She thought about Clara Pratt, who had watched for 6 months and said nothing, and then come 6 miles to say something small but true. She thought about what it cost people to say things and what it cost them not to. She reset the post. She packed the soil around it. She tested it with her weight and found it solid. Ronan came home that evening later than expected, and she could tell something had shifted before he was fully in the door. Something in the set of him, a tiredness that was not physical. "How was Prewitt?" she said. "Good," he said. "The Caldwells may be withdrawing the claim. Their attorney apparently told them the survey evidence isn't in their favor." "That's good news," she said. "Yes." He hung up his coat. He didn't immediately come to the table. She watched him. "What else?" He turned around. "I ran into Delman in town. Garrett Delman. He stopped. He told me something about what's being said." "About us," she said. "About you," he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, something tighter. "Specifically, what Agnes Woolley has been, the version of things she's been circulating." "I can imagine it," Selene said. "You shouldn't have to," he said. He looked at her directly. "Selene, what she's been saying, it's not just that you were a purchased bride or that the arrangement was improper. She's been saying," he looked like a man having to say something he'd rather not. "She's been implying that you came into this willingly, that you sought it out, that the arrangement was your idea." She went very still. "She's turned it around," he said. "Made it that you were ambitious, mercenary, that you saw an opportunity and you took it." The silence in the kitchen was complete. "So I'm not a victim," Selene said slowly. "I'm a schemer." "Yes," he said. "That's the current version." She sat down. Not because she felt faint. She didn't feel faint. She felt something entirely different, something with considerably more heat in it, but because she needed to be in contact with something solid. She stopped, sorted through the words available. "That's impressive, actually. As a reversal. She's managed to make the same facts mean the opposite thing." "Yes," he said. "And people believe it?" "Some people believe what Agnes Woolley tells them," he said. "She's been the authority on this town's opinion for 30 years. She looked at her hands. They were still slightly dirty from the fence repair, and there was a callus forming on her right palm from the post driver that hadn't been there in October. And she sat and looked at her changed hands and thought about what had been said about her in her absence by a woman who'd made her mind up before any evidence had been consulted. And she felt the particular helplessness of being narrated by someone else and being unable to correct it in real time. "I'm sorry," Ronan said. "Stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault," she said. "I brought you here," he said. "This situation is what it is," she said, "and we're in it." She looked up at him. "What do you want to do?" "I want to—" He stopped, tried again. "I've been thinking, in the wagon, on the way home, about what it would take to change it." "The town's opinion?" "Yes." She watched him. "And?" "I have an idea," he said. "But I need to think it through before. I need to be sure it's the right thing, that it's fair to you." "Fair to me," she said. "It would change things," he said, "between us. The terms of—" He stopped, and she could see him hitting the edge of something he wasn't ready to put into words. "I need a day," he said. "I need to think." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had been honest with her from the first day, who had never promised what he wasn't prepared to deliver, who had fixed her window and saved the burned stew and laughed, once, by the garden. And she said, "All right, take your day." That night she lay in the narrow bed and could not sleep, and listened to the house, and somewhere in the early hours she heard him in the study, the lamp on, paper being moved, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what the idea was, what it would change, what fair to you meant from a man who had been trying, in his particular limited, honest way, to be fair to her since October. She fell asleep before she arrived at anything, and dreamed of the garden, and woke to a gray dawn with the feeling that something was about to be decided. She was right, but she did not know yet what it would cost her to believe in it. She got up, built the fire, and made the coffee strong. The coffee was strong and the morning was gray, and Ronan came into the kitchen earlier than usual. She heard him before she saw him. The familiar sequence of sounds, boots on the floor, the coat off the peg, the particular way he moved through the house that she'd memorized without intending to. But this morning there was something different in the rhythm of it. Less automatic, more deliberate, like a man who'd rehearsed the walk to the kitchen and was now actually walking it. She was at the window with her cup. She didn't turn around immediately. He poured himself coffee, and she heard him set the pot back, and then there was silence. And the silence had a shape to it, full rather than empty, the way silences are when someone is about to speak and hasn't found the entrance yet. "I was up most of the night," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard the lamp." A pause. "I've been thinking about what I said, about an idea." She turned around then. He was standing at the counter with his cup, and he looked like a man who had not slept and was not trying to hide it. The tiredness was plain on him, sitting in the lines around his eyes, in the particular set of his jaw. But underneath the tiredness, there was something else, a kind of resolution. The look of a person who had been fighting something all night and had finally stopped fighting it, not from defeat, but from having made a decision. "Tell me," she said. He set his cup down. "I want to transfer a portion of the land," he said, "into your name, legally. A deed, recorded at the county office, that puts 200 acres of this ranch in your name and your name only." She looked at him. "Not as a gesture," he said. "Not as... I'm not trying to make a point to the town, although it would make a point to the town. I'm saying that the land would be yours. Actually, yours. You could sell it. You could leave and take it with you. You could do whatever you chose with it, without my permission, without any claim I'd have on the decision." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why?" she said. Not a question so much as an invitation to keep going, because she needed to hear all of it. "Because," he said, and stopped, and started again more carefully. "Because I've been sitting with something for a while that I haven't said, and I think not saying it has been its own kind of dishonesty, and I've tried very hard not to be dishonest with you." "You haven't been," she said. "I haven't lied," he said. "That's not the same thing." She waited. He looked at the window, then back at her, and she could see the difficulty in it. Not reluctance, not exactly, but the specific difficulty of a private person saying a thing that once said cannot be unsaid, which is a different kind of vulnerability than most people recognize. "I didn't expect... When I proposed the arrangement, I told your father, and I told you that I wanted someone to build a life with. That was true. But I was thinking practically and honestly, and without..." He stopped. "Without understanding what it would actually mean, to have someone in the house who noticed things, who fixed things, who found the survey notation I'd been looking at for 2 days and couldn't see." "Ronan, I'm not done," he said, and she closed her mouth. "I don't know exactly when it changed," he said. "I've been trying to locate it, and I can't. It wasn't one moment. It was the way you are with Thomas's letters, the way you talk to me about Daniel without making it into something it needed to be. The garden. The burned onions." He stopped briefly. "I thought about the burned onions for an unreasonable amount of time, which told me something I wasn't ready to know." She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry over the burned onions. She was absolutely not. "The point," he said, "is that what I feel about you now is not what I expected to feel, and I don't think it's fair for me to propose transferring land without telling you why I'm actually proposing it. The practical reason is true. It would give you standing, it would change what the town can say about you, it would make the terms of this arrangement actually equitable in a legal sense. Those are real reasons." He looked at her directly. "But the real reason is that I want you to stay. Not because the arrangement says you should. Not because leaving would be complicated. Because I want..." He seemed to find the words difficult in a way that had nothing to do with vocabulary and everything to do with having spent 34 years keeping this particular category of statement to himself. "I want you to want to be here. And I can't know if you want that if you don't have the genuine ability to choose otherwise." The gray morning light came through the kitchen window, and fell across the table between them and the coffee cooling in both their cups, and the seed catalog she'd left out the previous evening still open to the page on climbing beans. "So," he said, "the land is the real choice. If you take it and leave, I'll understand it, and I'll—" A pause. "I'll have been a fool, but that's my own problem. If you take it and stay, I need to know it's because you've chosen to, not because the alternative is difficult." She set her cup down on the counter. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. When you say you want me to stay—" She held his gaze because this mattered, and she was not going to look away from it. "What are you asking for? The arrangement as it's been? Or something different?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something different," he said. "If that's— I'm aware that what I want and what's reasonable to ask may not be the same thing." "What do you want?" she said, directly. Because she'd learned, in 8 months of living with this man, that directness was the only currency he could actually work with, that oblique questions got oblique answers, and she was done with oblique. He looked at her. "A real marriage," he said. "Whatever that looks like. However long it takes to get there. I know I'm not easy to live with. I know I'm—" He made a brief gesture that encompassed himself with something that was not quite self-deprecation, but was adjacent to it. "I'm aware of my limitations." "You're not as limited as you think," she said. Something moved in his expression. I laughed by the garden," she said. "I hadn't laughed like that and I couldn't tell you when. You said to cloud with feet, and I laughed, and it was—" She stopped. "I've been lying in that room for weeks not sleeping because I couldn't figure out how to say what I was feeling without risking the thing we'd already built. Which was— that felt like the cowardly version of me, and I don't like it." He was very still. "I'm not going to tell you I love you," she said, "because I don't know yet if that's the right word for it, and I won't say a thing I'm not sure of. But I will tell you that I stopped counting the days somewhere around December, and I don't know when the ranch started feeling like home, and I know exactly how you take your coffee, and those things mean something to me." She picked her cup back up because she needed something to do with her hands. "I'll take the land," she said, "because you're right that I should have it, and I'll stay. Not because leaving is complicated, and not because I don't have options, because this is where I want to be, and I'd like—" She paused. "I'd like to try for the real version, if that's still what you're asking for." Ronan Vale looked at her for a long moment in the gray morning kitchen, and whatever he was feeling was not something he put into a speech. He was not a man for speeches. He crossed the kitchen, which was not large, and he put his hand against the side of her face, carefully, the way you touch something you're not certain you're allowed to touch. And she leaned into it slightly, which was her answer. They stood like that for a moment in the kitchen, not saying anything, because the thing that had been growing since October had finally found its shape, and it didn't need words to hold it. The deed transfer took 2 weeks to process through the county office. Aldrich Prewitt handled it with the careful efficiency he brought to all legal matters, and he asked no questions beyond the ones required for the documentation, which Selene appreciated. She signed where she was told to sign. Ronan signed where he was told to sign. Prewitt filed the paperwork, and when it came back recorded and official, he handed her the deed across his desk with the mild manner of a man handing over an ordinary document rather than a piece of paper that meant, in ways that had nothing to do with acreage, that she was someone different now than she'd been when she walked in. She held it on her lap in the wagon on the way home and looked at the mountains. "How does it feel?" Ronan said. "Strange," she said. "Real." "It is real," he said. "I know." She folded the deed carefully. "I want to write to Thomas tonight. He'll understand what this means." "Tell him about the garden too," Ronan said. "The tomatoes are going to need more staking. I'd like his opinion on whether the method we're using makes sense." She looked at him sideways. "You've never met Thomas?" "No," he said, "but he seems like someone worth consulting." She turned back to the road. She was smiling and not entirely trying to stop it. "He's going to like you," she said. "He likes people who say what they mean." "I don't do much else," Ronan said. "I know," she said. "It's one of your better qualities." There was one thing left unfinished. She understood this without discussing it, the way you understand when a wound needs to be cleaned even when the cleaning is going to be worse than the wound itself. Red Hollow had been talking for 8 months. It had assembled a story about her and Ronan, 2 versions of it, both wrong, one that made her a victim and one that made her a schemer, and she had no illusions that the deed transfer alone would correct it. Legal documents were not the language the town operated in. It operated in presence and encounter, and the direct social fact of people being who they were in front of one another. The monthly gathering at Grace Methodist was the following Sunday. She told Ronan she wanted to go. He didn't try to talk her out of it. "I'm not going to make a speech," she said the morning before. "I'm not going to confront anyone. I just want to be there, as what we actually are, and let it be seen." "All right," he said. "You should probably come too," she said. "I was going to," he said. They arrived at the hall the same way they'd arrived in February, together, in the wagon, Selene in the dark blue wool dress that had served her through every significant public occasion of these 8 months. She'd considered buying something new and decided against it. This dress knew what had happened. It had been present for all of it. The hall was full. It was always full for May. Spring brought people out of their winter contraction and into something more social, and the May gathering was well attended on principle. She felt the room's attention shift when they walked in, the same ripple she'd felt in February, but different in texture, less predatory, more uncertain, like a room that had been expecting one thing and was reconsidering. Mabel Hatch found her within 5 minutes, which had never happened before. Previously, it was Selene who navigated toward Mabel, not the reverse. "Mrs. Vale," she said, and then, more quietly, "I heard about the land transfer." "News travels," Selene said. "In Red Hollow, it does." Mabel looked at her steadily. "Prewitt's clerk has a wife who talks." A pause. It's changed things. What people are saying." "Good," Selene said. "Or not. Either way, the deed exists regardless of what people say." Mabel made a sound that might have been approval. "Clara Pratt asked me to tell you she'd be here today. Said she wanted to be more visible in her support." "Tell her I'd appreciate that," Selene said. She moved through the room with Ronan at her side. Not in front, not behind, beside. And she spoke to people with the ordinary social competence she'd always had, and some of them responded with the warmth of those who'd made a decision to be kind and were committing to it, and some of them responded with the polite neutrality of people who hadn't fully decided yet, and one or two said nothing beyond the minimum. Agnes Woolley was in the corner. Agnes was always in the corner. Selene had not planned to go near her, but sometime in the middle of the afternoon, when the gathering had settled into its later rhythms and the room was louder and more relaxed, she found herself near the corner with no particular explanation for how she'd gotten there, and Agnes was there, and the distance between them was small enough that not acknowledging each other would itself be a statement. Agnes looked at her. Selene looked at Agnes. "Mrs. Vale," Agnes said. "Mrs. Woolley," Selene said. A pause. Agnes had the look of a woman who had prepared for several possible versions of this encounter, and was not certain which one was in front of her. "I understand congratulations are in order, regarding the property arrangement." "Thank you," Selene said, "though I didn't do it for congratulations." "No," Agnes said, "I expect not." Another pause. Agnes looked at Ronan, who was a few feet away talking to Garfield Pruitt about something that appeared to involve actual farming rather than social performance. And something moved in Agnes Woolley's expression that Selene hadn't expected, something more complicated than the comfortable certainty she'd been operating from for 8 months. Not remorse, exactly. Agnes Woolley was probably not built for remorse, but something adjacent to the recognition that a story you'd told confidently had turned out to have chapters you hadn't accounted for. "Your husband," Agnes said, "has been in this town for 6 years." "Yes," Selene said. "I may have—" Agnes stopped. For a woman who never stopped, it was striking. "I may have been incomplete in my assessment." It was not an apology. Selene knew enough about Agnes Woolley by now to understand that this was approximately as close to one as the woman was capable of producing, and she decided to take it for what it was rather than what it wasn't. "He is not what most people assumed," Selene said, "and neither am I." Agnes looked at her. Something in the look had changed from the February gathering. The comfortable authority was still there, but it was sharing space now with something more uncertain. The look of a woman who had been the narrator of a story and was being asked to consider that the people in the story had their own perspectives, and those perspectives might be inconveniently valid. "No," Agnes said finally. "I can see that." It was 3 words. It was not a transformation. Agnes Woolley would go home and tell her version of this day, and it would not be entirely consistent with what had actually happened, because that was the nature of people who had been certain for a long time and were not going to become uncertain overnight. But it was 3 words that had not existed in February, and Selene took them and moved on. Ronan found her near the door 20 minutes later. "How was Agnes Woolley?" he said. "Approximately who she is," Selene said, "which is not entirely bad and not entirely good, and probably not going to change significantly." "That's fair," he said. "She admitted she may have been incomplete in her assessment," Selene said. "In Agnes terms, that's a significant concession." "What did you say?" "That neither of us is what people assumed." She looked at him. "Which is true." He nodded. "Ready to go?" "Almost," she said. "There's one more thing." She moved through the room to where Clara Pratt was standing with two other women, and she went up to her and said, "Mrs. Pratt, thank you for what you said, and for being here today." Clara Pratt looked at her with a kind of relief that told Selene the woman had been carrying the weight of her delayed generosity for some time. "It was the least I could do," she said. "It was more than many did," Selene said. "I mean that." Clara pressed her hand briefly, the kind of gesture that doesn't need more than it is. And Selene went back to Ronan, and they walked out of the hall and into the May afternoon, which was warm and clear and smelled like the season finally meaning it. The drive home was different from every drive home before it. She didn't immediately know how to describe the difference. It wasn't noise. They were mostly quiet. It wasn't speed or route. It was the same road it always was. It was something in the quality of the quiet. In the beginning, the silences between them had been the silence of two strangers who hadn't figured out how to talk to each other. By December, they'd become the silence of people who'd found a cautious detente. By spring, they'd become something chosen, something comfortable. This silence was different still. It was the silence of two people who had said the hard things and were now on the other side of them, and the other side turned out to be ordinary in the best possible way. A road and a wagon, and the mountains turning gold in the late afternoon, and someone beside you that you'd decided was worth the difficulty of becoming known to. "Thomas is coming at the end of June," she said, "somewhere in the foothills." He looked at her. "You wrote to him?" "Last week. He wrote back yesterday. I was going to tell you, but then the Prewitt business and the gathering." She paused. "Is that all right?" "Of course it's all right," he said. "He can have the room off the kitchen." "That's my room," she said. A pause. "I know," he said. She felt heat in her face and was grateful for the late afternoon light that made it harder to notice. "He can have the loft," she said. "He'll like it. He likes being up high." "I'll clear it," Ronan said, "this week." "I'll help," she said. They came up through the last stretch of foothills, and the ranch came into view. The fences, the barn, the house with its two chimneys, and the porch board she'd replaced, and the kitchen window with the curtains she'd made. The kitchen garden was visible from the road if you knew where to look, a patch of deliberate green against the wilder growth. And she could see from here that the tomatoes had grown another several inches since yesterday, which meant they needed staking today or tomorrow. She'd stake them in the morning. She knew the method by now. She'd figured it out by trial and error, losing two plants to her early mistakes before she understood what they needed, and the understanding had been hard-won and was therefore solid. She thought that was probably true of most things worth knowing. They had supper that evening on the porch, which they'd never done before. She'd suggested it on an impulse, and Ronan had said all right without hesitation, and they'd carried the food out and sat on the repaired boards with the mountains ahead of them, and the last of the sun going off the peaks in stages, first the highest ones going dark, then the middle, and finally only the furthest ridge still lit, burning orange against the cooling sky. It was not an elegant meal. She'd made something simple, beans and cornbread and the early radishes from the garden, which were sharp and small, and had taken an entire month longer than the packet said they would. Ronan had brought out a jar of the preserved cherries she hadn't used at Christmas, because he'd thought of it, and she'd forgotten about them, and they ate them with the bread for dessert, which was an unlikely combination that turned out to work. "Next year," she said, looking at the mountains, "I want to try an apple tree." "You need two," he said, "for pollination." "Two, then." "There's a place along the south fence," he said. "The light's right." "I know that spot," she said. "I was thinking the same place." They sat with that. The last light left the ridge, and the mountains went to blue and then to dark, and the first stars appeared in the east, and the temperature dropped the way it always did once the sun was gone, and she pulled her shawl tighter, and he got up without comment, and came back with her heavier coat, and set it around her shoulders without making a thing of it, just did it, and she said thank you, and he said yes, and sat back down. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right." What would you have done if I'd left? She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the dark mountains. With the land. If I'd taken it and gone. He was quiet for a moment. Continued, he said. What else? Just continued. It's what you do, he said. When something doesn't hold, you find the shape of what's left, and you continue. She thought about that, about his brother, and the plan that had changed shape, about her family's farm and the debt, and the choice she'd made in the hallway outside her father's study, about the things that had not gone as expected, and the things that had grown anyway, the way the unnamed herb had grown in the corner of the garden where she hadn't planted anything, the way things will find room when the conditions are right, and sometimes when they aren't. I wasn't going to leave, she said. I want you to know that. Even before this morning, I'd already decided. When? He said. She thought about it honestly. Sometime in January, she said. When you showed me about the grain in the wood. He looked at her. The fence board. The fence board, she said. You gave me back the hammer instead of finishing it yourself. That was... She stopped, and then decided to say it because she was done with not saying things. That was when I stopped being afraid of you. Were you afraid? He said. Not with guilt, with actual curiosity. At the beginning. Not the kind of afraid I expected. Not, I didn't think you'd hurt me. I was afraid of being invisible. To me? To myself, she said. Of disappearing into the arrangement and becoming only what the arrangement needed and losing, she gestured at herself. Whatever this is? You were never in danger of that, he said. I know that now. I mean that I wouldn't have, that was never what I... Ronan, she said, I know. He looked at her. The darkness had settled fully now, and the stars were out properly, and in the cold, clear mountain dark, they were two people on a porch that had been fixed because she'd fixed it, and the garden was growing in the dark behind the house, and somewhere in the house was a deed with her name on it, and none of it was what either of them had pictured when October had started. I'm glad you didn't leave, he said. I know, she said. I'm glad too. Thomas arrived at the end of June with one bag, his sketchbook, and an immediate and uncomplicated opinion that the ranch was the best place he'd ever seen, which he communicated within the first 10 minutes by dropping his bag in the yard and walking to the fence line and staring at the mountains with the expression of someone encountering something they'd needed without knowing they needed it. I was 13 now, taller than he'd been at the wedding, and he had the look of a boy who was in the process of becoming something, not a man yet, not quite, but moving toward it with the uneven momentum of that particular age, all sharp angles and sudden certainties and unexpected depths. Ronan met him in the yard. Selene watched from the porch. She'd been aware, in the days before Thomas's arrival, of a low-grade anxiety she hadn't fully examined, the particular worry of introducing two people you care about and not being certain they'll recognize each other's value. Ronan put out his hand. Thomas shook it, which he'd been practicing. She could tell from the slight deliberateness of it, and looked up at Ronan with the direct assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend first impressions don't matter. Selene says you fix things, Thomas said. I try to, Ronan said. She says you're not easy to talk to. Thomas, Selene said from the porch. She said it nicely, Thomas said, without looking away from Ronan. She said you mean what you say, which is different. Ronan looked at the boy for a moment. Your letters are well observed, he said. Thomas blinked. You read them? Some of them. She leaves them on the table. The drawings too? The drawings too, Ronan said. The dog looked like a cloud with feet. Thomas's face split into a grin that was so like Selene's that she felt something move in her chest. He's old, Thomas said. He has a lot of extra skin now. It's hard to draw accurately. I'll show you the horses, Ronan said. If you want, Thomas wanted. She stood on the porch and watched them walk toward the barn together, the tall man and the almost tall boy, not talking much, which turned out to be fine because Thomas adjusted to Ronan's register within the first day in the way that people sometimes do when they recognize something in another person that matches something in themselves. At supper that first evening, Thomas ate 3 portions and talked about the East Field and the drainage fix and their father's improvement in general spirits. And Ronan listened and asked 2 questions, both of which were exactly the right questions, and Thomas answered them at length and then said abruptly, Do you have any wood I could use? I want to make something. What do you want to make? Ronan said. A box, Thomas said. For Selene. For her seeds. Something happened in Ronan's face. There's oak in the barn, he said. Good grain. I'll show you tomorrow. Thomas nodded and went back to his food. Selene kept her eyes on her plate and did not trust herself to look at either of them. The summer moved with the particular richness of seasons you hadn't expected to be good. The tomatoes came in heavy in July, more than she'd thought. She made preserves and gave some to Mabel Hatch, who accepted them with the straightforward pleasure of someone who likes tomatoes and is not too proud to say so. The apple trees went in along the south fence, both of them, two small committed things in the August soil that would not produce fruit for years and would require attention and patience, which seemed appropriate. The Caldwells withdrew their land claim in late June. Prewitt sent a letter that was professionally restrained and personally satisfied in equal measure. Ronan read it twice and set it on the pile of resolved things and did not mention it again. Red Hollow did not transform overnight. That would have been too clean, too neat, and life in small towns does not operate on clean lines. Agnes Woolley continued to be Agnes Woolley. Deirdre Stroud did not suddenly become warm. There were still conversations that stopped when Selene entered rooms, still looks that carried more weight than looks should carry, but there were other things too. Mabel Hatch had become genuinely friendly, the kind of friendly that shows up in small, consistent ways over time and is therefore more reliable than large gestures. Clara Pratt invited Selene to a quilting circle that met on Thursday afternoons, which Selene attended twice and then attended regularly because the women there were interesting in the specific way of people who do skilled work with their hands and have been doing it for years. Garfield Pruitt stopped Ronan in the street one afternoon in August and said, Ronan reported this with the slight bemusement of a man still adjusting to things going differently than expected. That he was glad the Vale place was being run properly and that the Caldwells had always been trouble, which in Pruitt's vocabulary constituted a significant statement of solidarity. The town's story about them shifted. Not completely, not overnight, but it shifted from purchased bride or ambitious schemer to something more complicated and therefore more accurate. People saw them together in town and saw two people who appeared to have arrived at each other by a difficult route and were managing it honestly. And honest people recognized honesty even when it made them uncomfortable. It was not vindication exactly. Selene had stopped expecting vindication somewhere around April, when she'd understood that what other people decided to believe was largely their own business, and she had limited power over it. What she had power over was herself, and the choices she made, and the person she was when she was being most accurately herself. That was enough. It turned out that was quite a lot. On the last day of August, Thomas went home. He stood in the yard with his bag and his sketchbook. Heavier now, more used, she'd noticed him drawing constantly during the summer, the horses, the garden, the mountains, and he hugged her with the sudden wholeness of a teenage boy who had decided that this particular moment warranted it. Come home for Christmas, he said. I'll try, she said. Bring him, he said. Not quietly. He said it at normal volume, intending to be heard. Ronan, who was standing 3 feet away, said, I'll see what I can manage. Thomas grinned and picked up his bag. Before he climbed into the wagon, the one that would take him to the stage into town, he went to Ronan and put out his hand again, and Ronan took it, and they shook, and Thomas said, The oak box came out well. You did most of the work, Ronan said. You showed me the grain, Thomas said. That's the part that matters. He climbed up, and the wagon took him down the road, and she stood at the gate watching until he was gone. When she turned back, Ronan was still standing in the yard, looking at the road. He's good, Ronan said. Yes, she said. He is. The oak box was in her room on the dresser, which was no longer a borrowed piece of furniture in a temporary space, but simply hers. It held the seed packets for next year, labeled in Thomas's inexact handwriting, and one letter from her father that she'd folded small, the most recent one, in which he'd said for the first time, not comfortable but happy, and she was glad he'd found the word. There is a thing that people misunderstand about difficult beginnings. They think the difficulty is the problem, that the obstacle is the enemy, that the hard start is something to be survived and then left behind. What she had learned, in a year of impractical evidence, was that the difficulty was also the foundation, that the careful, unglamorous, often uncomfortable work of building trust on ground that had no reason to trust was the thing that made what you built on it actual, not decorative, not provisional, actual. She did not romanticize it. Their marriage was not a romance, or not only, It was also an argument about the grain direction of fence boards and burned onions, and a land dispute that had cost 2 months of sleep, and the particular friction of two private people learning to be less private with each other without losing themselves in the process. It was imperfect in the ways that all real things are imperfect, which is to say in ways that were specific and sometimes inconvenient and occasionally maddening. But it was real, and she had decided, somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those ordinary days, that real was the thing worth having. Not the version of things that looks right from the outside, the version that holds when no one's watching. September came in golden. The morning light that month had a particular quality, lower and slower than summer, the shadows longer, everything a little more considered. She was in the garden in the early morning, cutting the last of the summer herbs before the frost came for them, when she heard him come out of the house and cross the yard. He sat on the porch step. He had his coffee, and she had hers, and the garden was still producing in its stubborn final effort, and the mountains were enormous and ordinary in the way they always were, which was the best thing about them. "The apple trees look like they're taking," he said. She looked over. The two small trees along the south fence were still standing, still green at the end of their first summer, which was not guaranteed and therefore was good news. "They need one more season before we'll know," she said. "Yes," he said. "But they're still there." She looked at them for a moment. "They're still there," she agreed. She went back to cutting herbs, and he sat with his coffee, and the morning went on around them, and in a few hours there would be work to do. There was always work to do. The ranch generated it reliably and without apology. But right now there was just the garden and the coffee and the mountains and the easy company of two people who had come to each other through difficulty and had decided, separately and together, that what was on the other side of the difficulty was worth the crossing. The apple trees stood in the September light, small and unproven and determined. In 2 or 3 years they would produce fruit, not reliably, not abundantly at first, but genuinely, the way things produce when they've had time to root properly. She already knew what she'd do with the first ones. She'd make something, maybe the preserved cherry thing from Christmas, but with apples, better than the first attempt, because she'd had time to practice, and practice was what she believed in. She'd make it, and they'd eat it at the kitchen table in the ordinary way of ordinary evenings, and it would taste like something specific, like the south fence and the turning of soil and 100 honest conversations and the slow work of becoming the person you want to be in the company of someone who is trying to do the same. That was the real inheritance. Not the land, though the land was real. Not the legal transfer of 200 acres, though that mattered, and she would never pretend otherwise. The real thing was this: the knowledge, earned day by day, that she had not disappeared into the life she'd been handed. She had made something of it. They had made something of it, imperfectly and specifically and without anyone's permission, and it was theirs. She cut the last of the sage and straightened up and looked at the mountains. They had been there before all of this, and they would be there after, which was either comforting or humbling depending on the day. Today it was comforting. She went inside and put the kettle on and started in on the morning, and the ranch moved around her the way it always did, necessary and imperfect and entirely, solidly real.